This is my version of the turning point in history that they chose. So would I have chosen this turning point in history? Maybe not, but this is the one they chose. So I'm going to try and stick with it. And this is their third turning point in Christian history, and it's Christmas Day, 800 Common Era. Christmas Day, 800 Common Era. Anyone know what happened on Christmas Day, 800 Common Era, that was a turning point in Christian history? I only know it because I was a liberal arts major, and it's a pretty major date in Western civilization. And it has to do with a guy named Charlemagne and a pope named Leo III. And it was the day that he was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor, okay? And so I'll tell you the story, okay? In 800 Common Era, there was no Europe, right, as we know it. There were no nations of Europe, no Germany, no France, right? Belgium, any of those places as we know them. There were only, in what is Europe now, just lots of warring clans, tribes, groups of peoples, and they'd been warring a long time. And they were, kind of would have alliances, and they would go back and forth. And this had been going on for a very, very long time because the Roman Empire had fallen apart, right, 500 years earlier, right? And the center of the Roman Empire was where in 800? Y'all remember? It was in Constantinople, right? It was in the east. That was where the emperor was, and that was the center of the Roman Empire.
Is our present Pope Leo the Fourth?
He is Pope Leo the 14th. He is Pope Leo the 14th. And I knew someone was going to ask me this question. So I went and found out if the present Pope Leo had thought at all about naming himself after this guy, and he did not. This is not the guy he wanted to name himself after. And once I tell you this story, you'll see why he did not want to name himself after this guy, okay? There have been 14 Pope Leos, okay? Most of them named themselves after the first Pope Leo, who was a pretty extraordinary pope. This guy, not so much, okay? But we'll come back to that. Okay, so it's 800 Common Era. What is now Europe was not Europe. Pretty dark place, pretty messy, chaotic place. But this guy, Charlemagne, who is the king of the Franks, has risen to power. He's a pretty powerful king. And he has had some real military victories. Pretty impressive military victories. And this pope, who is in Rome, Pope Leo, has been incredibly weak. I mean, he is a really weak pope. So weak that he has been actually sacked. Sacked is a kind of a weird word, but he's actually had armies come in and overtake him and imprison him and try and usurp him more than once. And he's had to run away and hide. And actually, he's run away to Charlemagne, to where Charlemagne is, and had to seek some kind of, protection from him. And more than once, over the last 10 years, Charlemagne has rescued Pope Leo. And at the end of 799 Common Era, Charlemagne takes Pope Leo and he brings his army and he literally marches Pope Leo back to Rome and puts him back on his quote-unquote throne and takes all of the people who had accused him of wrongdoing and basically rounds them up and says, say you're sorry to the Pope, at like a spear. And they all say, okay, we're sorry. And the Pope, who's a spiritual leader, forgives them all. You're forgiven. You're forgiven. They don't get killed or anything. And then the king, Charlemagne, says, good. Now let's have Christmas Mass. Let's all be peaceful and have Christmas Mass together. And the story goes that they go into St. Peter's Basilica, which was not quite as ornate as today, but it's in the same place that it is today. They all go in for Mass to St. Peter's Basilica, and the king, Charlemagne, is praying, and he gets up from praying, and unbeknownst to him, Pope Leo is ready with a crown. And he literally crowns him the Holy Roman Emperor right then and there without him knowing. According to the story, this was not exactly a good thing for Charlemagne. Some of you are really smart. You're more of a historian than I am. You can tell me why this was a bad thing. You want to tell me why this was a bad thing for poor Charlemagne to be crowned the Holy Roman Emperor? There already was one. Yeah, he was over in Constantinople, okay? There was already an emperor because the Roman Empire still existed. It still had its own place in Constantinople, and there was technically already an emperor in Constantinople. So by doing this, what Leo was doing was setting up what was going to become the big split between East and West, which you guys all remember from your Western civilization class, right? It was going to happen in 1020 or whatever. So that's the first problem, that was going to happen. The second thing that was going to happen, by making him Holy Roman Emperor, immediately what Charlemagne knew is he now was going to be responsible as the feudal lord for all of the people, their health, their welfare, their protection in all of the lands of what would have been, the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire from 500 years earlier, which stretched from the Atlantic Ocean, right, to the Black Sea, down to the Mediterranean. Why was that a problem? Well, because you had, the hordes from the north coming down that had to be fought off. You had hordes from the south coming up that had to be fought. You had hordes, I love that word, from the east coming over. I mean, there were hordes everywhere, if you read the history books. From Charlemagne's perspective, this meant a lifetime of military defense, if not to mention maybe military aggression. So this was not necessarily good news. But once the Pope crowned him in front of God and everybody, he didn't deny it, and he didn't back down. Yes.
Stacy, was this a time when there was a lot of Germanic tribes coming into the Western Empire?
Well, he was the Germanic tribe. He was the Germanic king.
Okay.
Yeah, he all the Germanic tribes had done their thing, and he was their king. He had conquered all the Germanic tribes, and that's why he was so powerful. He was the Germanic king. So the problem were going to be the Saxons, the Lombards, right? And there's a third one, Saxons, Lombards. I'll come to it in a minute. it's what we would call Italians, English, and the third, which will come to me in just a minute. So this is a unique moment, and there are three things we should be asking ourselves that when I was a kid learning world history, I did not ask myself. First of all, why is it that the Bishop of Rome thought he could crown an emperor? I mean, that was pretty, uppity. I mean, seriously, no pope. I mean, the Bishop of Rome was not necessarily, didn't necessarily have that kind of power. Why is it that Leo III thought he could do that? And why is it, if he was going to crown someone, he thought he could crown the king of the Franks? That's the second question. And then why is it that this relationship between the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and the king of the Franks, at this moment, created what would become about an 8th century long Christendom? And that's the word we're going to use today. This moment created 8 centuries of Christendom in Europe, for better or worse. And that's what we're going to talk about it, both for better or worse, that really changed Christianity and it changed the world. So that's what we're going to talk about. Leo III was born in Rome, and he died in 816. He was canonized, but look how long it took before they canonized him. He wasn't exactly one of the better popes. He was pope during this particular time. He really did have quite a special relationship with Charlemagne, mainly because Charlemagne protected him. And I'd say the one thing he goes down in history for, frankly, was not his theological acumen. It wasn't that he was a great churchman. It wasn't that he was great in pastoral care. He didn't build anything. He didn't create anything. He didn't do anything spiritual. The one thing he goes down in history for is he knew the right moment to link the church with political power. He knew the right moment to link the church with political power. Is that a good thing? Well, you decide when we get to the end of this. You get to make that decision. So let's talk about the Bishop of Rome. See, you guys, as Protestants like me, we tend to think of the papacy. We weren't taught a lot, unless you were raised Roman Catholic, you probably weren't taught a lot as children about the papacy, right? We were just taught, oh, those Roman Catholics have the Pope. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, always has been, always will be. But the papacy developed. It developed over hundreds of years. And the first two turning points you've already learned about, those first two turning points in the 200s, the 300s, there was no Pope in the same way that there is today yet. The papacy developed over the first 5, 6, 7, 800 years of the church. It took time to develop. And in fact, until the 3rd century, the title Papas, or Pope, was actually used for all high ecclesiastical bishops in the church. So we have writings from the 2nd and 3rd century with the word Papas being used for the Bishop of Ephesus and the Bishop of Milan. It was just a title being used for all high ecclesiastical bishops. It was first used in a special way for the title of the Bishop of Rome around 400 Common Era. And it wasn't used exclusively for just the Bishop of Rome until almost 1000.
Stacy?
Yeah.
Can I ask a really dumb question?
Sure.
Peter was supposedly the foundation of the church.
Yes.
The first pope I've heard before said.
Yeah, that's really not what it says.
Well, okay. He's the foundation of the church.
Yes.
Is there a connection between Peter and all the other leaders of the Roman church? Or, I mean, tradition has that he was the first founder.
The first Bishop of Rome.
Okay, is there a connection between he and all the other bishops of Rome, or is that more of a traditional thing in the Catholic Church?
Yes. And I'm not even being cute. That is really the right answer. Yes and yes. It would be an honest answer. That there is a connection we have writings of talking about him as the first bishop of Rome, and then there's a second, and then there's a third, But there's also this very strong tradition, church tradition of that places him back there as that first, we have writings from the 200s and 300s that are kind of going back to Matthew 16, 18, and that's the passage, and then rewriting history based on Matthew 16, 18. So both are true. And Roman Catholics tell it in a different way than a lot of Protestants, but I'll tell you who really tells it a different way is the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church has never taken Matthew 16, 18 in the same way that the Roman Catholic Church has. And they've been around a lot longer than the Protestant Church has, right? So they have always seen Peter as one of many apostolic leaders of the church, not the one and only. So it's kind of fascinating. If you just broaden out your lens, the Roman Catholic lens is only one lens. Does that make sense? Yeah. So Papas as a title began in the Western Church once the split between North and South, between East and West, the Orthodox Church split from the Western Church. That's when Papas became exclusively the Bishop of Rome. When the Western Roman Catholic Church split from the Orthodox Church, that's when it became exclusively the Bishop of Rome. Still, remember, the Pope is still the Bishop of Rome. I mean, that's still technically, and the title is the Servant of Servants. Did y'all know that? I mean, in Latin, the Bishop of Rome is the Servant of the Servants. I mean, that's still the title. Now, in the late 4th century, there were two incredible bishops of Rome. And many church scholars would say that we would have never gotten to Leo III and the crowning of Charlemagne and the importance of the Bishop of Rome in the history of the church if it hadn't been for these incredible churchmen early on in the life of the church. Now remember, they weren't popes, they were the bishops of Rome, but they began to take really important roles in the life of the church. One was Stephen and one was Damascus, and they became bishops among bishops. In other words, if the bishops in the church had concerns, they would appeal to the Bishop of Rome and say, which of us is right? And the Bishop in Rome would try and adjudicate their issues. And it was these were the bishops that were around when, we were trying to, some of the things y'all talked about last week, who was Jesus and did Jesus come for the Father or the Son, and, how's the Trinity developed? These were the bishops who were the Bishop of Rome when those first creeds were being developed. They also were the first bishops to start talking about Matthew 16, 18 and start reasoning that, if Peter was the rock that the church was built on, and if I'm the Bishop of Rome, maybe I am the bishop among bishops. But it was Gregory the Great in the late 500s, early 600s, who was probably the strongest bishop of Rome that there ever was. And it's under his leadership that Gregorian chant, the liturgy of the church, the great monasteries were built. And so it helped that some of the greatest churchmen of this time happened to also be bishops of Rome, so that the church began to lean on these people as all this writing about Matthew 16, 18 was also developing. So you see, by the time we get to Leo, even though he wasn't the brightest bulb in the shed. There was a lot of kind of work that had been done, that this was a position that was really very important. But by 800, all of a sudden, political alliance of church leaders began to be really important. Now, something happened in the world. You guys are so smart, you know. Something happened between here and here in the world that made political alliance for the survival of the church really, really important. Changed the world. Really, really important between here and here. Happened right about the end of the 630s. Anyone know what that was?
Muslims?
Yes, sir. In 622, Muhammad receives the call. And we have right down in here the spread of Islam. On his death, the caliphates begin. And in just 30 years, Islam goes from here to here. Meanwhile, look here. This is the seat of the Roman Empire right here, Constantinople. And by 750, we've got Islam going all the way over here, right? So you can see, it's just a quick look at how fast the world is changing and how the pressure on the world and on political alliances are so different than they were just 100 years before. And all of a sudden, the church in Rome, if you look at it geographically, the church in Rome all of a sudden is becoming much more important in terms of a place that can solidify political alliance and send missionaries and send, the powerful kind of work, up north. Remember, everything north up here in what is now, what we consider now North Europe, they were just pagan hordes, is how they were talked about. But that was ripe for missionary activity. And with the pressure coming from the east and from the south and from the west, having strong military might and being able to consolidate power was really important. And so all of a sudden, think about 800, when Leo III does this, Rome is the perfect place for the church to center itself, center power, and be able then to, from there, do what needs to be done to kind of shift the church in a new direction and expand the church. If you're going to expand the church, this was not the place to expand it from because there was too much pressure coming. And eventually, this is Turkey, so eventually this is going to be completely overtaken. Does that make sense? I think this is just a really good visual to show what was happening. From 768 to 800, Charlemagne had consolidated his kingdom. The Saxons were in the north and the east. The Spanish, that's it. The Spanish were coming from the west, and the Lombards from the south. So, he had shown an awful lot of might. And Charlemagne had created that powerful connection with the Papacy, with protection and alliance, as well as a kind of feudal fealty. So the two of them provided a lot of power to one another because the Pope had given Charlemagne some legitimacy, a lot of legitimacy. It was the first time that the church had crowned someone. The emperor in Constantinople had not been crowned by the church. That emperor just had the old emperor crown from the old Roman Empire. This was the first time the church had given legitimacy to a political leader, for better or worse. That's what had happened. And that legitimacy allowed for his military power to push out, down the Lombards, out the Spanish, up the Saxons, to do all kinds of things in the name of what? Jesus. In the name of Jesus, I push you out. In the name of Jesus. Yes, sir.
Who were the Lombards?
Italians, the ethnic group that we would call Italians. Yeah. Yep. So it's just kind of an interesting coming together of power and need at this particular time. So if you study Western civilization, obviously this is called sometimes the Carolinian. I can't say it right. I call it Carolinian, but that's not how historians call it. Renaissance. This is the early Renaissance, or Christendom, but it's from 800 to about 1600 in Europe. About 800 years, all learning, all art, all law, the social structure and economics of what would become Europe, or what was Europe at the time, would be, and I'm going to put it in quotes, Christian, right? Now, when I say Christian, friends, we don't mean necessarily that it's centered in the gospel, okay? Why do I say that?
It's mostly political, maybe?
Well, because no one's reading the gospel. Okay, remember there's no printing press. People can't read, right? Maybe there's a Bible around every now and then in a castle somewhere. But this isn't about religious ideas, theology, right? Gospel preaching of Jesus, Sermon on the Mount. That's not what we're talking about. When we say that these things are Christian, it's about church power. It's about church power. So let's look at what that might look like. Learning. When I say learning is Christian, what did that look like in the Christendom of European medieval times? Well, it meant that the few places where you could go to learn was probably being run by who? Monks, priests, and it was for who? Monks, priests. So there's your learning, right? And when we talk about art, who was paying for the art? The church. What was the art about? The church. Okay, you kind of getting the idea now? Social structure. If you were a noble person, if you were a high person in society, whose blessing did you need? Who did you need to patronize? The church. Okay, y'all are kind of getting on, okay? And the same with law, economics. There was a structure. How we have people railing about tariffs all the time right now. I know I don't understand tariffs, but someone does. That pales in comparison to the way things were done in the medieval time when it came to the church.
Is this why, Stacy, there's so much emotion around separation of church and state?
When it came in the 1700s, when we decided to write a constitution? Yes, sir. And then we're going to talk about that. Yes. And that's why we were considered so radical. Yes, there was a lot of emotion about it. Now, by the time there had been reform, there had been many reforms from this system in England by the 1700s, but not enough for the people who wrote our Constitution. But yeah, that's why there was a lot of emotion around that. Right. Okay? If you are really into history, you should go read a book. And the books, there are whole books on something called the medieval synthesis. That's the word they use. I tried to read this book, and I couldn't. I just couldn't. But that's the wording, that the synthesis of church and state really brought about, everything was synthesized, the political power, the economic power, the legal power. But I think for us lay people, it's not that hard, right? Everything was synthesized together. Here's the one thing that I think we can understand that we still see vestiges of, and it has to do with the sacramental system that still exists in the Roman Catholic Church. It developed during the medieval time, during this time, and it was one way of every person, peasant all the way up to the highest nobility, every part of your life had a sacrament, right? There was a way in which all of life, there was no separation between secular and sacred, right? From birth to death, everything was synthesized, right? So from the day you were born, in fact, baptism was supposed to happen really, really fast. You baptized as quick as you could, and right up until last rites, as you were dying, right? That the secular and the sacred were not separated, and everything, with the sacraments kind of took you all the way through your life. That's one way for us lay people of thinking about this synthesis. And in a Roman Catholic parish in the 50s or 60s, which is, some you guys grew up with people, you had friends who were in these parishes in the 50s and 60s. Anyone grow up in a community that had a real active Roman Catholic parish? I did. And they lived lives kind of like that. Everything was a little synthesized in their lives, They went to school, they had, feast days. Things were not as separated in their lives as it seemed to be in my little Protestant life, if that makes any sense. Same kind of thing. This is a really famous statue. Has anyone ever seen this one in St. Peter's? It's like the most famous statue of Charlemagne. He looks pretty good there, but that's the Michelangelo's. It's very, very famous. Okay. So what kind of turning point is this? If you go to Germany, this is his tomb in Germany. It's in this town that I can't pronounce, starts with an A, because I can't speak German. But some of you maybe have seen this. Has anyone seen Aarons, or A-R-E-I-N-S? No? I don't know. Really big cathedral, and it's all gold. And apparently he's in there.
Where in Germany?
I'm sorry, I've never been. I'm sorry. I don't know.
They can Google it.
You can Google it. Yeah, Google it. I've never been to Europe. I'm going next May, and I'm very excited. But I don't think I'm going here. So what kind of a turning point was this? Obviously, this was the concept of a unified Christian empire had never existed before, and this really did increase the church's influence. Some might even say it was this event and this time period that perhaps gave the church the power to spread across the whole world. This relationship between the papacy and secular rulers also gave the church the power to make it through what could have been a very dark period in human history, the Dark Ages, right? Probably helped the church survive the onslaught of some, clashes with Islam and that kind of thing. but it also led to some protection from both Viking raids and the expansion of Islam, and gave some stability to Europe in what was a really difficult time. So you can read all kinds of books that will talk about the positives and the negatives of this time period. But in God's economy, if you think about the way in which Christianity got protected and was able to thrive when maybe it could have been wiped out, there is something to be said about that. I've often thought the fact that Christianity got separated from Judaism and was spread into the Gentiles before the temple got destroyed in Jerusalem, so that it was able to thrive with the Gentiles. This is very similar, that Christianity moved into Europe before Turkey got overtaken, where all the Gentile churches, got basically wiped out. So it's interesting that Christianity kept finding new homes and new places of power.
I think that might be in Cologne, Germany.
You think so? Okay.
My guess.
Okay.
Because there's a big church.
There's a huge church in Cologne.
I think
Cologne has a huge cathedral.
Yeah.
It's not a church.
There is a huge church in Cologne, I know. But I thought in Cologne is where the three kings are, which I think is hilarious that the three kings are in Cologne, but whatever. Now, let's talk about the lasting impact on Christianity. I'm going to make a big leap to talk about church and state, because since this time, and I'm going back to what you were saying about the this whole issue of what is the relationship between the church and political power. We have never really, we still have to deal with this. And Europe, if you go to Europe and you go to churches in Europe, what's your experience when you go to a state church in Europe these days?
They're dead.
Huh?
They're dead.
They're dead. They're just beautiful,
Information center.
empty information centers. I mean, there is something to be, there is something that we need to be thinking about. There were some benefits, but there are also some issues. What happened promoted the spread of Christianity because obviously there were military conquests and missionary work that happened when Christianity was connected to the state. Having Christianity connected to the state did reform church administration. It established a more organized ecclesiastical structure. In Europe, because the church was connected to the state, you have those beautiful, incredible, state-sponsored, cathedrals, state-sponsored schools. You have amazing structures. The state supported the establishment of monasteries, which became centers of learning and culture. And the fusion of church and state gave the church authority, and the church was able to wield political power, for better or for worse. Yes, you found it.
In
Aachen,
Germany.
Aachen, Germany.
And that's how it's pronounced. It's like Kun.
Aachen, Germany. Which is really middle of nowhere now, right?
No idea.
I think. Okay, Aachen, Germany. Okay. And the three kings are in Cologne,
Okay.
which I think is bizarre. Why would the three kings be in Cologne? But whatever. Okay. I want to move to World War II. Because I think World War II is a good example of Europe was really tested during World War I and World War II with what happened when church and state remained fused, and the power of the state remained wielded in the church. And the German church in particular remained under the power of Hitler, right? while Hitler was doing what he was doing. And the Barmen Declaration was a declaration that was put together in 1933 by the Confessing Church in Germany. And these were Reformed Christians, Protestant Christians, who made a declaration that as Christians, there should be a separation between the state and Christian faith. And this is how the declaration goes. We reject the false doctrine as though the church were permitted to abandon a form of its message and order to its own pleasure or to changes in prevailing ideological and political convictions. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, their great men exercise authority over them, and it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. The various offices in the church do not establish a dominion over some over the others. On the contrary, they are for the exercise of the ministry entrusted to and enjoined upon the whole congregation. We reject the false doctrine as though the church, apart from this ministry, could and were permitted to give to itself or allow to be given to it special leaders vested with ruling powers. Fear God, honor the emperor. Scripture tells us that in the as yet unredeemed world in which the church also exists, the state has by divine appointment the task of providing for justice and peace. It fulfills this task by means of the threat and exercise of force, according to the measure of human judgment and human ability. The church acknowledges the benefit of this divine appointment in gratitude and reverence before him. It calls to mind the kingdom of God, God's commandment and righteousness, and thereby the responsibility both of rulers and the ruled. It trusts and obeys the power of the word by which God upholds all things. We reject the false doctrine as though the state, over and beyond its special commission, should and could become the single and totalitarian order of human life, thus fulfilling the church's vocation as well. We reject the false doctrine as though the church, over and beyond its special commission, should and could appropriate the characteristics, tasks, and dignity of the state, thus itself becoming an organ of the state. Lo, I am with you always to the close of the age. The church's commission upon which it is founded, freedom is founded, consists in delivering the message of the free grace of God to all the people in Christ's stead. Therefore, in the ministry of his own word and work through sermon and sacrament, we reject the false doctrine as though the church in human arrogance could place the word and work of the Lord in the service of any arbitrarily chosen desires, purposes, and plans. The Confessional Synod of the German Evangelical Church declares that it sees in the acknowledgement of these truths and in the rejection of these errors the indispensable theological basis of the German Evangelical Church as the Federation of Confessional Churches. And it invites all who are able to accept its declaration to be mindful of these principles in their decision in church politics. And it entreats all whom it concerns to return to their unity of faith, love, and hope. It doesn't sound like you would die for that, does it? But they did. Because if you read between the lines, they're just quoting scripture. But if you read between the lines, what they're saying is the church can't be an instrument of the state. And the state has a duty, but it can't go beyond what it's supposed to do. And the authors of this were killed for that. This is now part of the Book of Confessions of the Presbyterian Church USA as a historical document, reminding us that our denomination has always supported, and we have since 1776, supported the ideal of, politically anyway, the separation of church and state as a theological principle, not just as a political principle, assuming that the only way to really be able to exercise our faith is in a political system where the government can't tell us how to practice our faith, and where we are not, and where we are free to practice our faith as we see fit. Let me show you the Constitution. You know, I used to teach. Well, let me. I'll come back to this. Let me show you the Constitution first. I used to teach in college, and I was shocked that my students didn't know the Constitution does not say separation of church and state. Did you know that? Those words are not in the Constitution. The Constitution, this is the, they're called the religion clauses in our Constitution. It's in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's two distinct clauses, right? They're called the religion clauses. One is the establishment clause. We make no law respecting the establishment of religion. And this would go back, remember these people were from Europe. So this is going back to the fact that in Europe, religion had been established by the state. You know, this is an Anglican country. This is a Catholic country. This is a, you know, Dutch Reformed country. You know, there was an established religion by the state. So Congress will make no law respecting an establishment of religion is the primary source of the separation principle. It forbids the government from creating a national church, okay? Or endorsing a specific religion or favoring a religious belief over non-belief. It ensures that the government power can't be used to promote any particular faith, maintaining a position of neutrality in religious matters. This is freedom from religion. That's really what this is. Freedom from religion. The second part is the free exercise clause. States that Congress can't prohibit the free exercise thereof, right? The clause protects an individual's right to hold their own religious beliefs, to engage in religious practices. It guarantees that citizens can worship and follow their faith without government interference, as long as their practices don't violate laws that relate to public health, safety, or morals. This is freedom for religion. And that's what these clauses do, right? Freedom from religion and freedom for religion. And that is like the basis of the First Amendment right there. And it was Europeans who, steeped in the history of 800 CE, who came here, who said, no, this is the way it's going to be. Because of their history and experience, you know, in Europe. And what's interesting is, you know, they'd had a pretty long history, 1,000 years of history of, and what was involved, come on, you know your European history, what was involved in that 1,000 years? How much? How much war? Continuous war, literally continuous war, right? Pretty much continuous war. So I guess, you know, for me, you know, you know, obviously I came along long after the writing of the Constitution, right? But as a religious leader, and you guys as church people today, you know, this is still important because we want a robust and vital faith. And it's not this isn't a done issue. This isn't a settled issue. It is still a very active issue in American life. Would you agree with me? Disagree with me if you want. Disagree with me. Someone disagree with me. You're not going to disagree with me? Okay, it's still an active issue in American life. And I think it's important. I mean, we can just say, oh, you can disagree with me and let's just not talk about it. But I think we have to talk about it because it matters. Without separation, without understanding the First Amendment, let's put it this way, with the First Amendment, I believe we have the best possibility of robust and vital faith. In the modern era, the best possibility for robust and vital faith is our First Amendment protections. Because it's only with the First Amendment protections that I think we have the freedom to really be unleashed from, and this goes back to the hypocrisy that we were talking about, you and I earlier, be unleashed from the power and injustice and some of the hypocrisy and the history of abuse and things that have come along with the power of the state before. It's really important for the younger generations, frankly, that faith be something vital that is not a power trip, but is really spiritual and not just something that they're told is, this is the way it's going to be, and this is what this is what it means to be an American. You have to be this. And in fact, getting faith mixed up with being an American or being a patriot only muddies the water for people who don't know anything about faith. And with our politics being as messy as they are, it's not a place I want to go to talk about faith with people. I mean, I just don't. I never have. I really don't now. I just don't.
You keep talking about the First Amendment, freedom of speech and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Who has the correct application of freedom of speech? Is it these people that are rioting? See, that's the problem. Nobody agrees on what it means.
Yeah,
That's the point.
that's the whole point, right?
That's the point. Can you go back to the slide on the Constitution?
Sure.
I think our rights are very much under threat. When you read these rights, they say Congress shall make no law.
Yeah,
Our Congress is completely neutered right now.
they are neutered right now.
And the Supreme
Yeah.
Court is not,
Upholding, yeah.
well, they're like, what's our role, right?
Yeah.
We don't make laws either.
Yeah.
But there is a huge evangelical push to make this a Christian nation.
Yeah.
Which if Congress doesn't create, if somebody doesn't say, stop,
Yeah,
this is not protecting.
yeah, yeah.
We can't take, I guess I'm just saying, we can't take this for granted because so many other parts of the Constitution are being ignored right now.
That is true. And this Christian nation thing, I mean, this is a real
It's a real thing.
it's a real thing. And it's a real conundrum for Christians, because that was not the framers' intent at all.
And it also goes back to the power of it's like, is it the state? Does the state have the power to tell you have to be Christian and you have to be this kind of Christian?
Right. And it's so new. This really was, I mean, if this is in your lifetime that this Christian nation thing came to, I mean, 1980s,
I'm glad you talked about varmint because, Hitler was literally saying, I am going to make myself the head of the church.
Yes.
And we're going to drop the Old Testament because it's those Jewish people, and Paul was a Jewish wimp, so we're not going to
talk about Paul.
And so what is Christianity if that's what
Yeah.
happens, right?
Right. Yeah,
So in our lifetime, we have an example of how that can go wrong.
we do. We do.
The Bill of Rights didn't grant us rights. The founders acknowledged those were God-given natural law that was simply being protected by these amendments to the Constitution. So I think it's important to recognize that, and also, they're recognizing the separation of powers. That Congress is the sole authority to have the power to enact laws.
Yeah.
Well, I'll make an argument that we are the nation, because of communication and interconnectedness, that we have had a formed religion by the state, and that's science. It is the belief in science, and if you place your belief in science, it will steer you wrong. Because you can't put your faith in PhDs because they're biased.
But we have some in the room. They're nice people.
I play one too, but I review papers. I see it. I see it there.
Well, that's obviously not what was being discussed here, but I see your point. I see your point. But that's not what they were talking about. Yeah.
If they say we're based on a Christian nation, that's what they're going to go. But Christ was never spoken once in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence.
Very true.
So we were not a Christian nation.
Right.
We may have had Christian beliefs back then, but we're never a Christian nation from the basic, if that's what you're basing it on.
Yeah.
But what gets me is, so what's the separation between churches? Can I pray at a football game, at the end of a football game, and the school says no, but is the school interfering with my Christian rights? I mean, gets pretty crazy.
It gets very difficult, and that is this doesn't help with that nitty. I mean, we all, every community has to work that out, and we've been sloppy. One of the things that's become very clear is we have been very sloppy at protecting. I mean, we've not been careful as the years have gone on in protecting or thinking about or teaching about or really being careful in our thinking about these things. And we wake up one day and we have a Christian nationalist movement, that's overtaking a political party or part of a political party, or and we're like, what happened? What happened?
It also creates an opportunity for persecution
Yes.
for different things.
Yeah.
To some extent, it's years later trying to manipulate faith, just like you just walked us through the 1,000 years where you're trying to manipulate faith. David Brooks has written about this extensively.
He has.
And so I take a lot of comfort in 5 million people, doing a peaceful celebration of their freedoms.
Right,
and
exactly.
A lot of young people, detest this, and some of the reasons why they don't attend what we would call a growing Protestant church, because they don't like this. Their friends are multicultural, they're multi-faith based, and while they might have been raised in our family by Protestants that believed in the Lord, they're subjected to this political influence and they reject it because of their freedoms, whether they be female or male. They have people that are all the religions that they find peace with and they love. And so I really think it's a reflection of what we should know better than to do, which is manipulate something as significant as your faith to the benefit of your political power. It's not going to end well because people are going to reject it. The freedom, the democracy by itself would reject that.
So did y'all hear what he was saying about young people? I really do think this is important, that young people will reject the church writ large if they feel like the church is manipulating for political purposes.
And they do see that.
And they do see it. And they're not going to distinguish between a really nice Presbyterian church that's not doing that, from a Christian nationalist evangelical church that is doing. I mean, they're not going to make that distinction because it's not that big of a distinction. It's not. Yeah.
I have 3 totally unrelated thoughts.
You just go for it. Go for it, doctor. Go for it. Go for it, doctor.
And I suspect most people here are to remember when we always had fish on Friday in our school.
Yeah.
cafeteria.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because the places I lived in, fishing was a major industry. Number 2, it's not the very first and it's not the very last words, but if you look at the Gospels and look at the places that the Bible puts it in red, one of the very first things Jesus does is reject temporal power
Yes.
when he's tested.
Amen.
And one of the very last things he says to Pilate is, "My kingdom is not of this earth."
Amen. Preach it, brother.
If you are, it strikes me, if you're going to pay attention to what we think Jesus said, it has a pretty straightforward interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the third?
You want to talk about science?
No, it wasn't.
Well, don't make fun of me.
No, I'm done.
I'll
We had
debate
really
that.
good questions that lasted too long.
No.
I'll debate that issue.
I know, it's okay. It's okay.
Well, the
Yeah.
echo was just said, there's only one time when Jesus became violent.
Hmm.
And why was that?
In the temple, the money changing in the temple. Yep. A combination of the political and the spiritual right there in front of him.
In the name of God.
In the name of God. In the name of God. Yeah. In the name of God.
Here was
Yeah.
my third one.
What's your third one?
And it's your slide that did it. I think we need to bring out, dust off, and make more prominent the Mormon confession.
Yeah. Well, and there are better versions of it than this too.
Yeah,
But
I think it applies.
it really, the language is old fashioned, but using the words of Jesus and saying, looking at power and saying, this is how Jesus did it. And we need to look at power differently. I think is important. Yeah.
That was going to be my point. If you look at what happened with Leo and Charlemagne, that was done in fear.
It was definitely fear.
And if you look at what's happening now, it's done in fear. It's fear of people who are different from us. It's fear of change from what we knew. And it's mean.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's all out of fear. It shows a lack of trust in God. Whatever our world is, it's God's plan, right? But you have to trust God.
Yeah.
Even when things aren't going well, you can't force. It's like taking your own political power because you're afraid God can't do it, or God's not doing it fast enough, or whatever.
Or not well enough.
It's all fear.
That's right. You're not doing it well enough. I think I can do a better job. I can do a better job. It's interesting. It's so much, looking back at 800, and I can be so measured. I can go, well, Christianity survived maybe because of it. I can be more like, well. But it's harder in the moment, right? I can be much more judgmental in the moment because I can't see, where we're going. But anyway, thank you guys for putting up with me.